Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating story of language, theology, and the intense 17th century cultural collision between the English Puritans and the Algonquin people. Today on The Explainer, we're unpacking the historical reality of a man named John Eliot and a monumental 120-year cross-cultural mission that left an absolutely indelible mark on American history. But to really grasp the stakes of this era, we have to start with a haunting question asked directly by an elderly Native American man to the English settlers. He asked, why, seeing the English had been in the land for 27 years, they have never taught the Indians to know God until now. That question is just profound. It completely shatters any simplified view we might have of this history, revealing a deep, mutual curiosity that really set the stage for the massive cultural merger we're going to explore today. Which brings us to part one. Preaching to the wind. So, the year is 1646. John Eliot is about 40 years old, and he's attempting to make an incredibly difficult leap across a massive cultural chasm. For years, he actually had a native man live in his home just so he could painstakingly learn the deeply complex Algonquin language. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the specific location highlighted here, Natick, which translates to rejoicing. It's right in modern-day Newton, Massachusetts, and this exact spot is where Wabon's wigwam stood. On October 28, 1646, Eliot, accompanied by prominent friends like Thomas Shepard and Daniel Gookin, stepped into that wigwam and preached his very first successful sermon entirely in the Algonquin tongue. He preached for an hour and 15 minutes straight to the gathered crowd. He talked about the 10 Commandments, and, fascinatingly, he chose to preach on the vision of the dry bones from Ezekiel chapter 37. He dramatically quoted the verse, telling the crowd to prophesy unto the wind. Well, when he uttered those words, a total hush fell over the room. Literally every indigenous person in attendance suddenly turned and stared directly at their leader, a man named Wabon. Why? Because Wabon is actually the Algonquin word for wind. Eliot unknowingly spoke a brilliant pun. He was looking right at Wabon, effectively saying prophesy unto Wabon. It was this incredible aha moment that just deeply resonated with the crowd.
Let's move on to part two. The 3-hour Q&A.
Following his hour-long sermon, Eliot didn't just pack up and leave. He opened the floor. He demonstrated a profound respect for the Algonquin people by engaging in these grueling 3-hour question-and-answer sessions. One of their very first highly practical questions was this: does the white man's God hear Indian prayers? I mean, does God only speak English, or does he understand Wampanoag and Algonquin? Eliot's response was definitive. He reassured them that the exact same God who made the English also made the Native Americans, and that he understands all people and all languages equally.
But the questions quickly grew in philosophical depth. They asked, why didn't God kill the devil that made all men so bad? This brilliantly shows that the indigenous people weren't just passively sitting there listening. They were actively engaging in profound theological wrestling, posing the exact same problem of evil that theologians have debated for centuries.
And then they hit him with questions of immense emotional weight. Where do our little children go when they die, seeing they have not sinned? This question strikes right at the heart of the universal human experience of grief. And Eliot understood this pain intimately. He had 6 children himself and ultimately outlived 4 of them. So he approached their pain not just as some distant teacher, but as a grieving father.
To answer these complex questions, Eliot relied heavily on relatable visual metaphors. When they asked how they could believe in a God they couldn't literally see, Eliot pointed right to Wabon's wigwam. He argued that foxes and raccoons didn't build it, right? A human did. Just as the structure proves a builder, the world proves a creator. And when asked about the benefits of prayer, he used his hand. He wiggled his fingers to represent physical comforts, things like food, clothes, and houses. But then he held up his thumb to represent the massive, enduring spiritual mercies of wisdom and eternal life.
Which leads us to part 3, translating the Algonquin Bible.
Those marathon Q&A sessions revealed something critical. The Algonquin people desperately wanted to read the Bible for themselves, and that spurred Eliot into a massive linguistic endeavor. But translating the Bible meant merging 2 entirely different worlds. For example, when translating the book of Judges, Eliot hit a roadblock with the word lattice, as in a lattice window. The native people didn't have glass windows or lattices. The closest concept the native translator could suggest was an eel pot, which is a woven wooden basket used for catching fish. Realizing an eel pot didn't exactly capture the architecture of a window, Eliot brilliantly invented a hybrid word. He took the English word lattice and attached an Algonquin suffix, creating lattice-ot.
This was a staggeringly difficult, word-by-word grind that took years. But by 1663, Eliot accomplished something truly historic. He published the complete Algonquin Bible, totaling an enormous 1,180 pages. The whole thing was funded by a society back in England, supported by men like Robert Boyle and Edward Winslow. Astonishingly, this massive Algonquin text was the very first Bible of any kind ever printed in America.
Now, Part 4, the village of Natick.
By 1650, Wabon astutely recognized that the English were continually fencing in the land, so he specifically requested dedicated property for the Roman Christian Indians. This resulted in a 6,000-acre land grant along the Charles River, establishing the very first praying Indian village of Natick. So, the crucial point is how Eliot systematically structured the town's governance. He used a strict biblical model, pulling directly from Jethro's advice to Moses in Exodus 18, having the native people elect their own rulers of 10, rulers of 50, and rulers of 100.
As the leader, Wabon implemented a set of strict local laws to govern Natick. They instituted fines for breaking the Sabbath. They explicitly outlawed wife-beating, stating the offender would have his hands tied and face severe punishment. And they even fined men 5 shillings for wearing traditional long locks of hair. We look at these laws today to see exactly how deeply Puritan religious values were intertwining with everyday Algonquin life.
And, the physical footprint of this history is literally still visible today. If you visit modern-day Natick, Massachusetts, just yards from the Eliot Church stands a memorial rock plaque, and right down the road at the Free Beacon Library stands an obelisk dedicated to John Eliot's work. This history is written right into the local geography.
And finally, Part 5, Triumphs and Deep Doubts. Now, we have to remember, this wasn't some pristine, flawless, utopian project. It was a messy, complex human endeavor filled with profound highs and devastating lows. First, the profound highs. In 1651, the people of Natick solidified their community with a covenant that was just beautiful in its devotion. God shall rule over us. Lord, take us to be thy people, and let us take thee to be our God. It was a triumphant pledge that cemented the deep, genuine trust and friendship the Native Americans had developed specifically with John Eliot. Yet, the reality of human brokenness was always present. And that brings us to a heartbreaking micronarrative known as the T'other Swamp Incident. 3 older men in the village got drunk. Knowing that the town ruler, a man named T'other Swamp, would severely punish them, they devised a cruel plan. They intentionally intoxicated T'other Swamp's 11-year-old son, figuring the ruler wouldn't punish them if he also had to punish his own boy. But T'other Swamp chose the law over his own comfort. He punished the men and, incredibly painfully, had his own young son placed briefly in the stocks.
And this brilliantly illustrates the raw reality of this mission. Because when Eliot learned of the incident, he was absolutely devastated. Why? Because one of the 3 men who intentionally got the child drunk was Eliot's own trusted interpreter, the very man who sat beside him translating the Holy Scriptures. Eliot's own diary entries reveal his vulnerable self-doubt. He wrote, "I began to doubt about our intended work. I knew not what to do. My very heart failed me." He was questioning everything.
But despite those devastating doubts, Eliot and the Algonquin people persevered together for decades. As we wrap up, their story leaves us with a profound final thought to chew on. When 2 entirely different worlds collide, can true understanding ever be built without a permanent cost to both? It's a messy, beautiful, and highly complicated history that still echoes in how we build cross-cultural bridges today. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer, and definitely keep exploring this amazing chapter of the past.